Rebecca Stone had always envisioned her life in a quiet, idyllic neighborhood, away from the chaos of her high-stress career as a corporate attorney. The opportunity to buy a house in an upscale suburban area had been a dream come true. The property was everything she had hoped for: a spacious backyard perfect for gatherings, a newly renovated pool glistening under the sunlight, and a high perimeter fence that gave her the privacy she craved. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could finally exhale and focus on herself for the first time in years. For Rebecca, this wasn't just a house, it was the foundation for a life she'd been building brick by brick, one legal case at a time. Her first few months in the neighborhood passed in blissful quiet. Rebecca spent her weekends arranging her patio furniture, landscaping the garden, and meticulously planning the final touches for her backyard, a serene oasis complete with lounge chairs, potted plants, and soft lighting for evening relaxation. The pool was the centerpiece of it all, and she couldn't wait to host her first summer gathering. The neighbors, though not overly warm, seemed cordial enough. Rebecca often exchanged polite waves with the older couple across the street and occasionally nodded hello to the dog walkers passing by. Life seemed peaceful, almost too perfect to be true. Then came her first encounter with her neighbor, Henry Drake. She had seen him only once before, when she was moving in, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s with a perpetually furrowed brow and a demeanor that radiated hostility. He lived in the house directly adjacent to hers, a sprawling property that seemed oddly neglected compared to the rest of the meticulously maintained homes in the area. His yard was overgrown with weeds, his porch sagged under years of disrepair, and his fence leaned precariously, as if one good storm might topple it. Rebecca hadn't thought much of him until the morning she stepped into her backyard and saw the beginnings of a crude barbed wire fence slicing through her property. She stared at it, stunned, trying to process what she was seeing. The fence wasn't just an eyesore, it was a blatant violation of her space. The jagged metal posts had been driven deep into her lawn, cutting off access to her pool and slicing through the beautifully manicured garden she had worked so hard to create. The pool gate was locked with a heavy padlock, and a freshly printed "Private property, no trespassing" sign dangled from one of the posts. Rebecca's initial reaction was disbelief. Surely this had to be some sort of mistake. Wasting no time, she marched over to Henry's house and rang the doorbell. The sound echoed hollowly inside, but there was no answer. She knocked harder, her irritation mounting, until she heard the heavy shuffle of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open just enough for Henry to peer out, his face set in a scowl. What he barked, his tone already defensive. Rebecca struggled to keep her voice calm. "Hi, I'm Rebecca, your neighbor. I think there's been some sort of misunderstanding. There's a fence being put up on my property. I assume it's yours." Henry's eyes narrowed and he opened the door just wide enough to step onto the porch. "It's not a misunderstanding," he said flatly. "That fence is on my land." Rebecca blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. "Your land?" "No, I'm pretty sure that part of the yard is on my property. I have the deed and the survey map to prove it." Henry crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "Your map is wrong. That section's been in my family for decades. You can ask anyone around here." Rebecca's patience began to waver. "I don't know what you've been told, but I'm confident in my property lines. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want with my land," Henry interrupted sharply. "If you've got a problem, take it to court." And with that, he turned and disappeared back into his house, slamming the door behind him. Rebecca stood there for a moment, stunned by his audacity. Who did this man think he was, unilaterally deciding that her backyard belonged to him? She returned to her house, her mind racing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a direct challenge to her rights as a homeowner. If Henry thought she would back down, he was sorely mistaken. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Workers appeared early in the morning, finishing the barbed wire fence with industrial efficiency. Rebecca tried to reason with them, but they shrugged and told her they were just following orders. The once beautiful backyard she had spent so much time perfecting was now bisected by a menacing barrier that seemed to mock her. Worse, Henry's smug attitude only fueled her frustration. Each time she tried to confront him, he dismissed her with curt remarks or ignored her altogether. Rebecca decided it was time to take action. She gathered all her property documents, including the deed and the survey map, and reviewed them thoroughly. Everything clearly indicated that the land in question was hers. She contacted a surveyor to confirm the property lines, but the process would take time during which the fence would remain an ugly scar on her yard. Meanwhile, strange things began happening. One morning, Rebecca woke up to find her garden hose slashed and her outdoor furniture overturned. Another day, the lock on her pool gate was mysteriously replaced with an even sturdier one, making it impossible for her to access her own pool. At first, she thought it might be a coincidence or a prank, but the incidents became too frequent to ignore. Someone was deliberately targeting her, and she had a sinking suspicion that Henry was behind it. As days turned into weeks, Rebecca felt the weight of the conflict pressing down on her. She had moved to this neighborhood for peace and tranquility, but instead she found herself embroiled in a battle she hadn't anticipated. Her backyard, once a symbol of her hard work and independence, now felt like a battleground. But Rebecca wasn't the type to give up easily. If Henry wanted a fight, she was prepared to meet him head-on. This was her property, her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Rebecca's frustration turned into determination as she decided to take her first step toward reclaiming her property. She knew the importance of acting decisively but also legally. The next morning, after reviewing her property deed one last time, she called a local land surveyor. She explained the situation in detail, emphasizing the urgency of confirming her property lines. The surveyor, a meticulous professional named Eric Mallory, assured her he could prioritize the job but warned that it would take a few days to gather the necessary records and conduct a thorough assessment. Rebecca felt a small sense of relief, knowing that help was on the way. However, the sense of relief was short-lived. That evening, as she returned home from work, she noticed something new, an ominous addition to the barbed wire fence. Bright yellow no trespassing signs had been attached at regular intervals, and a series of padlocks now secured every gate. Her stomach sank as she realized the pool area was now completely inaccessible, barricaded by Henry's aggressive modifications. It wasn't just the physical intrusion that unnerved her, it was the audacity. It was as if Henry was daring her to fight back, confident she wouldn't be able to challenge him. Her first instinct was to march over to his house and demand an explanation, but she stopped herself. Confronting Henry hadn't worked before, and she doubted it would now. Instead, she decided to document everything. She pulled out her phone and carefully photographed the fence, the padlocks, and the signs. Every detail would be recorded, just in case she needed evidence later. The next morning, Rebecca received a call from Eric, the surveyor. He informed her that he had begun pulling records from the county office and would be conducting the on-site survey later that week. Rebecca thanked him, grateful that progress was being made, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were going to get worse before they got better. That same evening, her suspicions were confirmed. Rebecca had just settled into her living room, a mug of tea in hand, when she heard a loud crash from the backyard. Her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the window. In the fading light, she could barely make out a figure retreating toward the far side of the fence. When she stepped outside to investigate, she found her patio table overturned, its glass top shattered into pieces. The once pristine garden beds surrounding the pool were trampled, with deep footprints cutting through the soil. Rebecca's anger flared as she realized this wasn't just vandalism, it was intimidation. She called the non-emergency police line and reported the incident. An officer arrived about 30 minutes later, a young man named Officer Hughes, who seemed polite but slightly disinterested. He examined the damage, took her statement, and asked if she had seen anyone. When Rebecca mentioned the figure she had seen fleeing the scene, he nodded but offered little reassurance. "We'll file a report, Mom," he said, flipping his notebook closed. "But without clear evidence or a witness, there's not much we can do." Frustrated but determined not to let this slide, Rebecca asked if she could install security cameras around her property. Hughes confirmed that it was within her rights as a homeowner, which gave her an idea. If Henry or anyone else was responsible for this, she would catch them in the act next time. The next morning, Rebecca purchased a set of high-resolution security cameras and spent the better part of the day installing them. She positioned them carefully to cover the backyard, the fence line, and the pool area. If anyone tried anything again, she would know. A few nights later, the cameras proved their worth. Rebecca had just finished dinner when her phone buzzed with a notification. The motion sensors had detected activity in the backyard. Her pulse quickened as she opened the live feed. There, in the grainy black and white footage, she saw two figures crouching near the fence. One of them appeared to be adding another padlock to the gate, while the other held what looked like a bucket. She watched, frozen, as the second figure began pouring something into her pool. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained the situation. This time, the police arrived more quickly, with two officers carefully entering her backyard to investigate. Rebecca stayed inside, peering through the curtains as they examined the pool. One of the officers knocked on her door a few minutes later, his expression serious. "It looks like they dumped some kind of chemical into the water," he said. "Probably a cleaning agent or something similar, but we won't know for sure until it's tested. Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" Rebecca didn't hesitate. "It has to be Henry Drake. He's my neighbor, and he's been harassing me ever since he put up that fence." The officer nodded, taking notes. "We'll have someone take a sample of the water for testing. In the meantime, I'd recommend not using the pool until we know what's in there. As for your neighbor, we'll speak to him, but unless we catch him in the act or have stronger evidence, it's going to be hard to prove anything." Once again, Rebecca was left feeling helpless. The security footage showed the intruders but didn't capture their faces clearly enough to identify them. She knew Henry was behind this. Who else would go to such lengths to intimidate her? But proving it was another matter entirely. Still, she refused to back down. If anything, these escalating attacks only strengthened her resolve. The following day, Rebecca reached out to a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. Her attorney, a sharp and confident woman named Olivia Grant, reviewed the situation with a critical eye. Olivia assured Rebecca that the fence was a clear violation of her property rights and that they could take legal action if the survey confirmed her ownership of the disputed area. However, she also cautioned Rebecca that cases like these could take months to resolve, especially if Henry decided to fight back with counterclaims. As the days passed, Rebecca began to notice a pattern. Each time she made progress, whether it was installing cameras, consulting her lawyer, or scheduling the land survey, Henry seemed to retaliate. One morning, she woke up to find her mailbox stuffed with dead leaves and garbage. Another day, she discovered that someone had thrown a rock through one of her backyard lights, shattering the bulb. The constant harassment was taking its toll, but Rebecca refused to let it break her. Finally, the day of the survey arrived. Eric, the surveyor, spent hours carefully measuring the property lines, comparing them to the official records. Rebecca hovered nearby, anxious but hopeful. When he finished, Eric approached her with a clipboard in hand. "Your instincts were right," he said. "The fence is definitely on your property by several feet, in fact." Rebecca felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. Armed with the survey results, she and Olivia could move forward with legal action. But as Rebecca looked out over her once beautiful backyard, now scarred by the barbed wire fence and the remnants of Henry's vandalism, she knew this battle would be anything but simple. Henry wasn't just trying to claim her land, he was waging a war of attrition, hoping she would give up before the fight even began. Rebecca clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. If Henry thought she would surrender, he was sorely mistaken. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she was prepared to do whatever it took to protect it. Rebecca woke up the next morning with a glimmer of hope. Armed with the surveyor's confirmation that the fence encroached on her property, she was ready to take the first decisive step toward reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Her attorney, Olivia Grant, had already drafted a formal notice to Henry, demanding the immediate removal of the fence. Rebecca had expected resistance, but she felt confident that presenting the survey results would force Henry to back down, or so she thought. The day started calmly enough. Rebecca was in her kitchen, sipping coffee and reviewing emails when the doorbell rang. Standing on her front porch was a man in his late 40s wearing a blazer and holding a leather portfolio. He introduced himself as Alan Price, a mediator from a property dispute resolution service. Rebecca's confusion was immediate. She hadn't requested mediation. Alan explained that Henry had preemptively initiated the process, claiming he wanted to resolve the issue amicably. Rebecca's jaw tightened as she realized what was happening. This wasn't a genuine attempt to settle the matter, it was a tactic designed to stall her. Nevertheless, she agreed to participate in the mediation, knowing that refusing would make her appear uncooperative if the dispute escalated to court. The session was scheduled for the following week, giving Rebecca just enough time to prepare. When she returned to her backyard later that day, her sense of calm evaporated. The barbed wire fence, which had already been an eyesore, had been fortified. Henry had added thick metal rods along the top and bottom, making it nearly impossible to cut through without industrial tools. Additionally, fresh private property signs had been hammered into the ground every few feet, their bold red letters glaring at her like a taunt. Rebecca clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling over. It was clear Henry wasn't just trying to defend his claim, he was escalating the conflict. Over the next few days, the harassment intensified. Rebecca came home one evening to find her outdoor furniture overturned and her garden hose slashed again. On another night, her security cameras captured a figure creeping along the fence line with a flashlight. Although the footage wasn't clear enough to identify the trespasser, Rebecca was certain it was Henry or someone working on his behalf. She sent the footage to Olivia, who advised her to document everything but warned her not to take matters into her own hands. It was sound advice, but Rebecca's patience was wearing thin. The day of the mediation arrived, and Rebecca entered the neutral meeting space with cautious optimism. Henry was already seated at the table, his face a mask of indifference. Alan Price, the mediator, began the session by asking each party to present their case. Rebecca went first, calmly explaining the situation and presenting the surveyor's findings. She laid out her property deed and the official map, which clearly showed that the fence was on her land. Henry's response was as infuriating as it was calculated. He claimed that the survey was flawed and presented his own evidence, a set of outdated maps that showed vaguely drawn property lines with no clear markings. To Rebecca's astonishment, he also brought up a decades-old family anecdote, claiming that his late father had always said the land in question belonged to them. "That fence is protecting what's ours," Henry said with a smug smile. "I'm just maintaining what's rightfully mine." Rebecca shot him a glare, her temper barely contained. "Your father's stories don't override legal documents. This survey is certified and up to date. The land is mine, and the fence is a violation of my property rights." Alan attempted to steer the conversation back to a constructive tone, but Henry's stubbornness derailed the process at every turn. When Rebecca brought up the repeated acts of vandalism, Henry dismissed her accusations with a casual shrug. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "Maybe you should get better security." By the end of the session, it was clear that mediation was a dead end. Alan concluded the meeting by noting that Rebecca had provided substantial evidence to support her claim, but that Henry was unwilling to cooperate. As they left the room, Henry leaned in close to Rebecca and muttered, "You're wasting your time. You'll never win." Those words echoed in her mind as she drove home. That night, Rebecca reviewed her options with Olivia, who advised her to file a formal complaint with the local zoning board. This would put additional pressure on Henry and provide a legal foundation for removing the fence. Olivia also recommended hiring a private investigator to look into Henry's background, suspecting there might be a pattern of similar disputes in his past. Rebecca agreed, though the cost of the investigation made her wince. Every step in this battle seemed to come with a price tag, and she was beginning to feel the financial strain. Still, she knew that giving up wasn't an option. This was her home, her sanctuary, and she couldn't let Henry's bullying tactics force her out. As Rebecca waited for the zoning board to process her complaint, the situation took an even darker turn. One evening, while she was in the middle of a video call with Olivia, the lights in her house flickered and went out. Alarmed, Rebecca grabbed a flashlight and made her way to the circuit breaker, only to find that the main switch had been flipped. When she stepped outside to investigate further, she noticed something chilling. A heavy-duty lock had been placed on her side gate, effectively trapping her in her own yard. The implications were clear. This wasn't just about property anymore. Henry was trying to intimidate her on a personal level, pushing her to the brink of fear and frustration. Rebecca immediately called the police, who arrived within the hour and removed the lock. The officers filed another report, but once again, there wasn't enough evidence to link the incident directly to Henry. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. The sense of violation was overwhelming, and the constant stress was beginning to take its toll. She decided to install even more security measures, including motion-activated floodlights and additional cameras. If Henry or anyone else tried something again, she would be ready. A few days later, the private investigator, a no-nonsense man named Thomas Ellis, delivered his findings. As Olivia had suspected, Henry had a long history of disputes with his neighbors. Over the years, he had filed multiple frivolous lawsuits, claiming ownership of small parcels of land adjacent to his property. In most cases, his neighbors had chosen to settle or move away rather than endure the drawn-out legal battles. "Looks like he's running the same playbook here," Thomas said. "He pushes people until they give up. You're the first one who's pushing back." Rebecca felt a surge of anger as she read through the investigator's report. Henry's actions weren't just malicious, they were part of a calculated pattern of behavior. But this time, his tactics had backfired. Rebecca was more determined than ever to see this through, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. Armed with the investigator's report, Rebecca and Olivia prepared for the next phase of their fight. The zoning board complaint was moving forward, and Olivia was drafting a lawsuit to demand the immediate removal of the fence and compensation for the damages Henry had caused. As Rebecca looked out at her backyard that evening, the barbed wire fence still looming like a scar across her property, she knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Henry might have been able to bully others into submission, but he had underestimated her resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension between Rebecca and Henry reached new heights in the weeks following her decision to file for a restraining order. While the legal process crawled forward, the conflict in her backyard escalated into a relentless battle of intimidation and defiance. Henry had gone from openly hostile to cunningly subtle, making it harder to prove his involvement in the ongoing harassment. Yet Rebecca refused to back down, determined to expose him for the manipulative neighbor he was. Rebecca's lawyer, Olivia, had advised her to focus on building a rock-solid case. Olivia stressed that the stronger their evidence, the harder it would be for Henry to mount any credible defense. Armed with that advice, Rebecca spent her days compiling every document, photograph, and video she could find. The surveyor's report, police incident logs, security camera footage, it was all carefully cataloged and ready to present in court. But the process was exhausting, and Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was always one step ahead. Her suspicions were confirmed one afternoon when she received an unexpected visit from a city zoning official. The man, dressed in a rumpled blazer and holding a clipboard, knocked on her door with a stern expression. "Ms. Stone, I'm here to follow up on a report we received regarding unauthorized construction on your property," he said, barely glancing up from his clipboard. Rebecca's brow furrowed. "Unauthorized construction? I haven't built anything." The official tapped his pen against the clipboard. "According to the complaint, your pool and patio area were expanded beyond permitted boundaries. We'll need to inspect the site to determine if there's been a violation." Rebecca's heart sank. She knew this was Henry's doing. It was another tactic to derail her efforts and shift the focus away from his illegal fence. She led the official to the backyard, doing her best to stay calm. He spent nearly an hour taking measurements, scribbling notes, and snapping photos before finally delivering his verdict. "There doesn't appear to be any violation," he admitted reluctantly. "Everything seems to be within the approved boundaries. I'll file my report, but you might want to keep your documentation handy in case this comes up again." Rebecca thanked him, though the encounter left her seething. She knew Henry was trying to weaponize bureaucracy against her, and while she had dodged this particular bullet, it was clear he wasn't done. That evening, she updated Olivia on the situation, and her lawyer reassured her that such baseless complaints would only work against Henry in the long run. "It shows a pattern of harassment," Olivia said. "We'll use it to strengthen our case." Despite Olivia's confidence, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that Henry was playing a much larger game. Her suspicions deepened when she stumbled upon something strange while clearing debris from her backyard. Beneath a pile of dead leaves near the fence line, she uncovered a small metal marker partially embedded in the ground. The marker was old and rusted, but the faint outline of engraved text caught her eye. It read Boundary Survey, 1973. Rebecca's mind raced as she stared at the marker. It didn't match any of the markers on her survey map, and its location suggested it had been placed intentionally to create confusion about the property lines. Could Henry have planted it there to bolster his false claims, or was it part of a larger scheme that predated even her ownership of the house? She took photos of the marker and sent them to Olivia, who promised to investigate further. A few days later, Rebecca received a call from Eric, the surveyor. He sounded uneasy. "Rebecca, I've been looking into the history of your property, and I came across something you need to see. Can we meet in person?" When they met, Eric handed her a folder filled with old property records, survey maps, and handwritten notes. "Your property lines are solid, no question about that," he began. "But I found records of a dispute from decades ago involving your lot and Henry's. Apparently his family tried to claim part of this land back in the 1970s, but they lost. The court ruled in favor of the original owners of your house." Rebecca scanned the documents, her pulse quickening. The details were eerily similar to her current situation. Henry's family had argued that a portion of the backyard, including the pool area, was historically theirs. The court had dismissed their claim, citing insufficient evidence. "This is exactly what he's trying to do now," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and vindication. "He's recycling the same argument, hoping no one will remember." Eric nodded. "It gets worse. That marker you found? It's not an official boundary marker. It was planted there during the original dispute as part of their attempt to manipulate the property lines. I'm certain Henry knows about it, and he's using it to back up his lies." Rebecca felt a surge of rage as she absorbed Eric's words. Henry wasn't just a difficult neighbor, he was a calculated schemer who had inherited a family obsession with expanding their property at any cost. Armed with this new information, Rebecca and Olivia prepared to file a formal counterclaim against Henry's fence. They included the historical records and Eric's findings as key evidence, arguing that Henry's actions were part of a deliberate campaign of deception. But Henry wasn't about to give up without a fight. That weekend, Rebecca returned home to find a handwritten letter taped to her front door. It read, "You're playing a dangerous game. Drop this now, or you'll regret it." The words sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let fear control her. She filed a police report and handed the letter over to Olivia, who added it to their growing collection of evidence. The situation took an even darker turn when Rebecca discovered that her security cameras had been tampered with. She was reviewing footage one night when she noticed several hours of blacked-out video. When she checked the cameras the next morning, she found that one of them had been physically shifted to point away from the fence line. Someone had been on her property, and they had taken great care to cover their tracks. Determined to regain the upper hand, Rebecca hired a private investigator to dig into Henry's background. Within days, the investigator uncovered a troubling pattern. Henry had a long history of disputes with neighbors, many of which involved property lines or access rights. In several cases, his aggressive tactics had forced homeowners to move, allowing him to claim portions of their land through questionable means. While he had never been convicted of any crime, the pattern was undeniable. Rebecca shared the findings with Olivia, who saw an opportunity to turn the tide. "This proves that he's been targeting you deliberately," Olivia said. "We'll use this to show the court that he's a repeat offender with a history of bullying his neighbors. It'll strengthen your case significantly." As the court date approached, Rebecca felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. The fight had taken a toll on her mentally, emotionally, and financially, but she wasn't about to let Henry win. This was more than just a dispute over land, it was a battle for her right to live in peace, free from harassment and intimidation. The night before the hearing, Rebecca received a call from Olivia. "I've got good news," she said. "We've subpoenaed records from the zoning office, and they confirm that Henry's fence violates multiple regulations. It's the nail in the coffin for his case." For the first time in weeks, Rebecca felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she had the truth on her side. No matter how hard Henry tried to intimidate her, she wouldn't back down. This was her home, and she was prepared to defend it with everything she had. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a thick tension hanging in the air. Rebecca dressed carefully, choosing a sharp yet understated suit that conveyed confidence and determination. Olivia had warned her that Henry's team might try to spin the narrative, portraying her as an aggressive outsider attempting to take what wasn't hers. But Rebecca knew the truth, and she had the evidence to back it up. Still, as she entered the courthouse, she couldn't ignore the subtle knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. This was a pivotal moment, and she couldn't afford to lose. To her surprise, Henry didn't appear in court alone. He was flanked by a man Rebecca didn't recognize, tall, polished, and oozing confidence. Olivia leaned in to whisper, "That's Richard Malone. He's not just a lawyer, he's a fixer. People like Henry hire him when they want to play dirty." Rebecca clenched her jaw but nodded. She had anticipated underhanded tactics, and if Henry thought this man would intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. The hearing began, and as Olivia presented the evidence, Rebecca felt a surge of pride. The surveyor's report, historical property records, and the photos of the damaged pool and fence all painted a clear picture of Henry's harassment. For a moment, it seemed as though the case was tilting in Rebecca's favor. But then Richard Malone stood to speak, his tone calm and measured. He began sowing seeds of doubt, suggesting that Rebecca's survey might not be entirely accurate, and that the historical records she relied on could have been improperly filed. He also implied that Rebecca's attempts to remove the fence had been reckless, endangering workers and escalating tensions unnecessarily. "My client has simply been protecting what he believes to be his family's land," Malone concluded, his gaze fixed on the judge. "And while Miss Stone may feel inconvenienced, her approach has been more combative than cooperative." Rebecca's cheeks burned with anger. She wanted to shout that it wasn't true, that she had done everything by the book, but she forced herself to stay silent. Olivia, however, was unflinching. She calmly dismantled Malone's arguments, one by one, pointing out the inconsistencies in Henry's claims and emphasizing the clear evidence of harassment and property damage. By the end of the hearing, it was clear the judge was leaning toward Rebecca's side. Still, she knew this wasn't a final victory. The judge ordered a temporary injunction requiring Henry to stop any further construction or interference with Rebecca's property, but the case would continue as more evidence was reviewed. Leaving the courthouse, Rebecca felt a mix of relief and frustration. The injunction was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, and she knew Henry wouldn't take the decision lightly. That suspicion was confirmed later that evening when she returned home to find a new surprise waiting for her: a mound of soil and debris dumped across her driveway, completely blocking her car from pulling in. Scrawled across the pile in spray paint were the words, "Stay in your lane." Rebecca's hands trembled as she snapped a photo of the scene and sent it to Olivia. "This is escalating," she said over the phone. "He's getting bolder." "You're right," Olivia agreed. "But this works in our favor. Every stunt like this makes it easier to prove his intent. Keep documenting everything. We'll use it." The next few days were a whirlwind of tension. Rebecca arranged for a crew to clear the debris from her driveway, but the sense of violation lingered. Each night, she found herself checking the locks on her doors and windows multiple times, unable to shake the feeling that Henry or someone working for him was watching her. The security cameras continued to capture strange activity: shadows flitting near the fence line, faint sounds of movement in the early hours of the morning, and once, a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down her spine. Determined not to let fear paralyze her, Rebecca decided to go on the offensive. She hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Henry's background, hoping to uncover anything that could strengthen her case. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Dana, quickly proved her worth. Within days, she discovered that Henry had been involved in multiple property disputes over the years, each following a similar pattern. He would claim ownership of land that wasn't his, escalate the situation with intimidation tactics, and often force the other party to settle or give up entirely. It was a clear pattern of behavior, and Dana promised to dig even deeper. While Dana worked her angles, Rebecca focused on rebuilding her backyard. The pool had been professionally cleaned, the padlocks on the gates were replaced with her own, and the barbed wire fence stood as a bitter reminder of the ongoing battle. She refused to let Henry's actions rob her of the sanctuary she had worked so hard to create. But just as she began to feel a sense of normalcy returning, the situation took a darker turn. One night, Rebecca was jolted awake by the sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and checked the security cameras. The footage showed two figures near the back of her house, one of them holding what looked like a crowbar. They were smashing the lights she had installed along the fence, plunging the area into darkness. Rebecca dialed 911, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The police arrived quickly this time, and the intruders were gone by the time they swept the area. However, the officers found fresh footprints leading toward Henry's property, and Rebecca didn't believe for a second that it was a coincidence. She filed yet another report, but the officers warned her that without direct evidence linking Henry to the crime, there wasn't much they could do. It was a frustratingly familiar refrain. The next day, Dana called with an update that shifted the entire trajectory of the conflict. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "I found records of a private deal Henry made a few years ago with a local developer. The deal fell through, but it involved a proposal to expand his property right through your backyard. He's been trying to push these boundaries for years, and now that the developer's back in the picture, he's ramping up his efforts." Rebecca's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about a family obsession with property lines, it was a calculated attempt to increase the value of Henry's land for financial gain. The stakes were higher than she had realized, and she knew she had to act quickly. Olivia began drafting an amended complaint that included the new evidence, arguing that Henry's actions were part of a larger scheme to defraud Rebecca and profit from her land. That evening, Rebecca received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small envelope containing a key and a note. The note read, "You think you're smart, but you don't know the half of it. This isn't over." The cryptic message sent a shiver down her spine, but instead of fear, it fueled her determination. She handed the package over to Dana, who promised to investigate its origin. Rebecca's fight with Henry had gone beyond a simple property dispute. It was now a battle of wills, a high-stakes game where the consequences extended far beyond her backyard. But as much as the conflict weighed on her, it also clarified her resolve. She wasn't just defending her home, she was standing up to a bully who had spent years exploiting others. And she wasn't about to let him win. The tension that had simmered for weeks finally reached its breaking point when Rebecca received an urgent call from her lawyer, Olivia. "Rebecca, I just got wind that Henry filed an emergency injunction against you," Olivia said, her tone sharp and serious. "He's claiming that your recent actions, removing parts of the fence, installing new cameras, and cleaning the pool constitute destruction of evidence and trespassing on his family land. He's trying to force you to stop all activity on your property until the court hears his new claim." Rebecca's grip on her phone tightened. She had been prepared for Henry to fight dirty, but this was a new low. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of anger brewing inside her. "We'll counter it immediately," Olivia replied. "The judge knows this case is about more than his baseless claims, but it's clear he's trying to stall and throw more roadblocks your way. Meet me at the courthouse tomorrow morning. We'll shut this down." That night, Rebecca barely slept. Every creak of her house felt like another intrusion, every rustle of the wind outside a reminder of how much her sanctuary had been invaded. Her once beautiful home now felt like enemy territory, surrounded by an invisible line of hostility. But even in her sleepless state, she resolved to face Henry head-on. He wouldn't intimidate her out of her own home. The next day in court, Olivia dismantled Henry's arguments with precision. She presented the survey results, the footage of intrusions on Rebecca's property, and the historical records proving that Henry had a long-standing pattern of using deception to claim land. Rebecca could see Henry fuming across the courtroom, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear as Olivia methodically dismantled their case. The judge, visibly unimpressed by Henry's tactics, ruled in Rebecca's favor, striking down the injunction and ordering Henry to cease any further interference with Rebecca's property. It was a major victory, but Rebecca knew it wouldn't be the end. She could see it in Henry's eyes as they left the courtroom. This wasn't over. That night, her fears were confirmed. As she settled in for what she hoped would be a quiet evening, Rebecca heard a loud bang from the backyard. Rushing to her security feed, she saw Henry himself, armed with bolt cutters, ripping down sections of the new fencing she had installed. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. This time, she wasn't going to let him walk away. The police arrived quickly, catching Henry in the act. For the first time, he couldn't deny what he had done. They cuffed him on the spot for trespassing and vandalism, his angry protests echoing through the night. As they led him away, he shouted, "You think you've won? This isn't over. You'll regret this." His words hung in the air, a chilling reminder of his unrelenting hostility. The incident finally gave Rebecca the leverage she needed. Olivia wasted no time filing an emergency motion to force the removal of Henry's illegal fence, citing his blatant disregard for the law and his escalating behavior. The judge, fed up with Henry's antics, ruled in Rebecca's favor, ordering the immediate dismantling of the fence and granting her additional protections against further harassment. The following morning, a crew arrived to tear down the barbed wire fence that had caused so much pain and chaos. Rebecca stood in her backyard as the workers methodically dismantled the structure, piece by piece. The sight was bittersweet. She felt a sense of vindication, but the damage to her property and peace of mind lingered like a scar. As the last section of the fence came down, Rebecca spotted something buried beneath the concrete posts that had anchored it to the ground. A small metal box, rusted and caked with dirt, was unearthed by the workers. Curious, Rebecca had them hand it to her. She pried it open to find old documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of the area. The map showed her property and Henry's, but what stood out were the markings on the land, notations about underground pipelines, potential mineral deposits, and a hand-scrawled note that read future expansion site. The documents suggested that Henry's fight wasn't just about an old family grudge or a misplaced sense of entitlement. He had been trying to claim her land for a much bigger reason: financial gain tied to development or resource extraction. Rebecca immediately sent the contents to Olivia, who confirmed their significance. "This proves that Henry's been scheming for years," Olivia said. "It wasn't just about property lines, it was about money. This strengthens our case and could lead to criminal charges." As the dust settled, Rebecca finally began to feel the weight of the conflict lifting. Henry, now facing legal action not just for harassment but also for potential fraud, was no longer the looming threat he once was. The physical barriers he had erected were gone, and the legal walls closing in on him were growing higher with every passing day. But as Rebecca stood in her backyard that evening, watching the sunset reflect off her restored pool, she knew the scars of this battle would remain. The yard no longer felt like the untouched haven it once was, but it was hers again. And no matter how much Henry had tried to break her, he had failed. Her resolve, her dignity, and her home had endured. This was her land, her life, and her victory. In the weeks following the dismantling of Henry's illegal fence and his arrest for trespassing and vandalism, Rebecca's life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The chaos that had consumed her backyard was replaced by the sound of restoration, a team of landscapers replanting the ruined garden beds, the gentle hum of pool equipment being repaired, and the satisfying clink of new gates being installed. Every improvement felt like a step toward reclaiming the peace that Henry had tried so hard to steal from her. Henry, meanwhile, had all but vanished from the neighborhood. After his arrest, he was released on bail, but his reputation was irreparably damaged. Neighbors who had once sided with him or stayed silent began to distance themselves, whispers spreading about his long history of manipulation and bullying. Olivia kept Rebecca updated on the legal proceedings, where additional charges were mounting against Henry after the discovery of the documents buried beneath the fence. The evidence of his fraudulent attempts to expand his property for financial gain had led to an investigation by local authorities, and developers tied to his scheme were also being scrutinized. For Rebecca, the victory was sweet but not without its costs. Her financial reserves had taken a significant hit from legal fees and property repairs, and the emotional toll of constant fear and vigilance still lingered. Nights were quieter now, but she found herself double-checking locks and glancing at the security feed out of habit. It would take time to truly feel safe again. One afternoon, Olivia called with news that finally brought Rebecca a sense of closure. The judge ruled in our favor for damages, Olivia said. Henry's been ordered to pay for the restoration of your property and cover all legal fees. Given the evidence against him, his assets are being seized to fulfill the judgment. Rebecca exhaled deeply, a weight lifting off her shoulders. Does this mean it's finally over, she asked. For the most part, Olivia replied. There's still the criminal case, but you're no longer directly involved. This is the end of your fight. With the legal battle behind her, Rebecca decided to turn her focus back to the home she had fallen in love with. She hosted a small gathering to thank the friends and neighbors who had supported her throughout the ordeal. The backyard was a symbol of her resilience, the pool sparkling under the soft glow of string lights, the garden blooming once more. Standing with a glass of wine in hand, she looked around at the faces of those who had rallied behind her, feeling a sense of gratitude and strength. As the evening wound down and the last guest left, Rebecca lingered by the pool, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. For the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful rather than ominous. The battle with Henry had tested her limits, but it had also reminded her of her own resilience. She had stood her ground, fought for what was rightfully hers, and come out stronger on the other side. The next morning, as she walked through her garden, Rebecca noticed a small patch of earth where the buried documents had been found. The grass hadn't fully regrown, leaving a faint scar on the otherwise pristine lawn. She crouched down, running her fingers through the dirt, and smiled to herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. This land, this home, and this life were hers to protect and cherish. With a deep breath, she rose to her feet, ready to move forward. The fight was over, but the lessons it had taught her would stay with her forever. Strength wasn't just about enduring hardship, it was about standing up, no matter how many times someone tried to push you down. Rebecca had faced a storm and come out the other side, and she was determined to make the most of the calm that followed.